This podcast is sponsored by the Trader Funding Program by Forex Analytics. Do you want to trade somebody else's money but want to receive the lion's shares of the profit and take none of the risk? Pass an assessment with a one-time fee and trade your own live trading account. There's no time limit to pass. Various account sizes are available based on your needs, and each comes with the Forex Analytics platform and access to one of the most active trading communities in the markets for a period of time. Visit traderfundingprogram.com for more information.
Good morning or afternoon. Welcome to the MicDropMarkets podcast. Our guest today is Sal Mercogliano. He is an associate professor of history at Campbell University in North Carolina and an adjunct professor at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Marine Transportation from the State University of New York Maritime College, along with a Merchant Marine Deck Officer's License, Unlimited Tonnage Second Mate, a Master's in Maritime History and Nautical Archaeology from East Carolina University, and a PhD in Military and Naval History from the University of Alabama. He's also the host of What's Going On with Shipping on YouTube. So welcome, Sal. We're very excited to have you with us today. We have a lot to talk about with everything that is happening in the shipping world today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So Sal, I have to begin with a question. Are you responsible for what's going on in the Red Sea? Is this like a huge scheme of you that the name of your fantastic YouTube channel named What's Going On with Shipping gets more clicks? I cannot imagine. I guess 10 years ago, if somebody would have made a channel called What's Going On with Shipping, people would have said, oh my God, this must be a very nerdy channel. That is so boring. Why would anybody care about it? And now it's basically all the rage and everybody's curious about it.
I still think it's a nerdy channel. Let's be clear about this. This is nothing that's going to be attracting any sort of stylish points. It all started back with Ever Given. I make the joke all the time. If I would have known all it took was to, drive a ship into Asia in the Suez Canal, I would have bribed a helmsman years ago. But it seems to be a topical issue. I mean, shipping is in the forefront, and I think it's really important to contextualize what's happening with shipping and not just look at the disasters, but to talk about how this fits into the overall pattern, because our entire economy is driven by shipping.
I mean, you combine, because you're a historian, you're a political scientist, you have experience in the maritime sector, so you really kind of pull together lots of different areas. So as I guess, Tracy, one of the first things that we are curious to know is, what is your assessment of what's going on to the Red Sea? And if you would kind of have to filter what's noise in the media and what's the actual signal, what would you focus on, or what kind of struck you as the most interesting parts of what's currently going on?
So obviously what makes the Red Sea very unique right now is a key maritime choke point. We talk about these key areas where trade kind of funnels through. This is why Ever Given getting stuck in the Suez was so important back in 2021. What we're seeing right now is the Houthi have been able to dislodge a good chunk of the supplies and ships that go through this vital waterway. About 11% of the world's shipping goes through. But what they have been able to do is push the most valuable vessels out of that trade route because of the increased threat associated with their attacks. Now, remember, their attacks have not so far really produced large numbers of hits. We just recently had a ship, Ruby Max, to get hit, and we believe it's been abandoned. This may be the first ship we see that's a total loss. We haven't seen any crew members injured or killed yet, which has been very beneficial. But what the Houthi have been able to do is raise the cost to do business through the Bab el-Mandab, which means that for ocean shippers, particularly high-value vessels, we're talking about container ships, we're talking about LNG and LPG, liquefied natural and petroleum gas carriers, product tankers. It is more economical to go around Africa than it is to risk the ship going through the Bab el-Mandab. And what the Houthi have been able to do is something we haven't seen literally since the world wars, which is displace a global supply chain route through use of combat forces. And the US Navy and the British Navy have not been able to deter the Houthi in any way. Matter of fact, in some ways, they've spurred them on even further. And what we're seeing now is an escalation in the number of attacks.
How is that possible? As somebody who does not have significant military experience, how is it possible that a kind of ragtag army like the Houthis, despite I'm sure that they get some interesting equipment, both from the Chinese and particularly the Iranians, that they cannot be kept under control by the US and Royal Navy? That strikes me as, and that's what I would like to ask you, is it a lack of technology or is it a lack of political/military will on parts of the West? Are we kind of fighting with one arm tied behind our backs?
Well, I mean, commercial ships are risk adverse. I mean, they're going to go where the profits are and where they're going to minimize their dangers. And once the Houthis start using technology, and again, this is technology they're getting from other places. It's not Houthi technology. They're getting this from the Iranians, who in turn are getting them from other places. I mean, we've seen the first use of an anti-ship ballistic missile. This is a missile that takes a high trajectory and come down used. So they're using some pretty sophisticated technology. The fact that they're creating the threat is enough to deter them. The problem you have in the use of a military resolution to this problem is that there's always the chance, no matter how hard the US, the British hit the Houthi, they're still going to exist. There's no way to eliminate the threat 100%. And all the Houthi have to do is come close a few times to create the doubt. And that's what they're doing right now in global shipping. The Saudis have been dealing with the Houthis for 10 years. They haven't been able to eliminate them. And because the Houthi are located on that western side of Yemen, astride the main shipping channel by which Europe and Asia are connected, they're in an advantageous spot to be able to hurl these missiles, create these threats, and thereby shift trade on a much longer pattern. And again, they're having a disproportionate influence. You know, their return on investment in what they're doing has been phenomenal.
And how do you expect this to kind of affect global trade? I mean, do you expect this to disrupt supply chains? I mean, it seems like the markets really aren't factoring in that right now. So what is your assessment of that?
So what we're seeing right now is it's hitting key areas. So we saw, for example, when the initial displacement took place, several factories, Tesla manufacturing in Europe and a few others in and around Europe, all of a sudden had to shut down or slow down production because of key technologies and key components that weren't arriving. We're going to see it in the United States here, really with the end of the Chinese New Year and the end of that period of time where key commodities and key products may be delayed coming in. We're seeing a little bit of congestion where shipping companies are readjusting. But the key thing here to note is that container lines, which are the ones that we've focused a lot on with this displacement, have been in a very advantageous position. They have excess capacity. They have excess ships. They have excess room because they've been buying ships as a result of the supply chain. So what they're doing is putting more ships on the routes, and therefore they can absorb the losses. So what you're seeing is a slight spike in the ocean freight. We've seen it pretty stabilized now, but we saw anywhere from 2 to 3 times the freight rate overall. But what you're not seeing is what we saw in COVID, where you're not just seeing the increase of the ocean freight rates, but you were seeing warehousing and road and rail. You were seeing it across the entire transportation spectrum. Here, you're just seeing it on the ocean freight routes. And so that displacement has not been bad. We've also seen some alternative transportation being used, for example, air. We're also seeing overland shipments, either by rail or by truck, across Asia to Europe. For example, you can truck something from China to Europe. It'll take you 18 days, which sounds really long, but it is actually faster than going by boat right now around the southern end of Africa. But where we're going to see some issues is going to be in key other areas. Is going to be seeing petroleum, in liquefied natural gas, in liquefied petroleum gas, in diesel fuel. This is where we're starting to see the displacement take place. And because we don't have large fleets of those vessels, that means we're either hauling goods much longer distances, what's known as ton miles, which means that the transportation costs are going to increase, or we may start seeing the regionalization of shipments. For example, US LNG may not be going to Asia as much as it's going to Europe. And let's not forget, we also have another key choke point that's having an issue right now, and that is the Panama Canal, which is only at 2/3 its capacity.
And that was going to be my next question, is how is that compounding with the problems that are going on in the Red Sea?
So when you looked at COVID, that was a global event. So you had all of a sudden everything hit at once and affected every end of the transportation spectrum. With Red Sea, that's one aspect. But then when you add the Panama Canal into it, it's a whole nother aspect. So just for an example, containers. If you're hauling containers from Asia over to the United States, typically pre-COVID, you'd go into LA and Long Beach. Well, LA and Long Beach had issues. We saw issues during the supply chain crisis. And what we saw is a lot of traffic begin to flow through the Panama Canal, especially that new lane of the Panama Canal that opened in 2016, because now you can send the ship that can carry 15,000 boxes, vice 4,500 boxes through the Panama Canal. Well, now because of low water, because the Panama Canal is fueled by a freshwater lake that is at very low level. It's actually below the level it's normally at the height of the dry season. We're at the height of the wet season right now. They've had to reduce the number of passages through from about 36 ships down to 24 and reduce the loads on vessels. So for example, if you're taking containers from East Asia going through the big lane of the Panama Canal, you may have to stop and offload about 1,500 to 3,000 boxes, put them on the ground, take your ship through the Panama Canal, meet those boxes on the other side after they've been railed across the isthmus, go up to the East Coast, Gulf Coast of the United States, offload, and instead of going back through the canal, you may continue a round-the-world voyage, head eastward. You would normally go through the Suez, but you can't do that now because of the Houthi, and now you're going around Africa. So what we're seeing is this elongation of trade routes. And again, it's not having a huge impact on overall costs, but what we're seeing is incremental costs. A lot of shippers right now are getting charged surcharges for extra fuel, for port handling, for cargo handling that they had not anticipated prior to those voyages.
So would it be fair to say that many of these decisions, both in the Panama Canal, but maybe also partially in the Red Sea, is, for example, due to insurance costs or to these surcharges that you mentioned? So it's not so much fear of being the victim of a military attack, but just that you have an insurance, and the insurance says if you go through the Red Sea, we're not going to pay if anything happens. So as you said before, just out of avoidance of risk avoidance, you say, well, then in that case we don't do it, because even if we have a problem that is unrelated to the Houthis, if our insurance doesn't pay, we really have a problem. So it's kind of more a financial consideration than let's say the might of those who blockade that important artery of global trade.
Yeah, it is the perceived threat and danger more than anything else. Give you an idea, 10 years ago, MOL Comfort, a container ship, about 8,500 boxes, broke up and sunk. That cost from the insurance company was about $250 million. And that's for a ship maybe a third to a half the size of some of the ships that go through the Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandeb. So insurance companies don't want to take that risk at all. So they're charging extremely high rates. And so when you do the math and you add the cost to go through the Bab el-Mandeb for insurance, which may be 1% of $250 million, you're talking about $2.5 million maybe. Then you add a Suez Canal transit in there, you're talking about $3 million. It is much more economical and safer to just head around Africa, take the diversion and go that way. And there's a lot of other costs that are associated. Fuel costs become much higher going around. Fuel in South Africa is much higher. If you run at a higher rate of speed, you're going to be paying a tax when you arrive in the European Union because of carbon taxes. And so, a lot of shippers who put their boxes on ships or book this cargo months and even years in advance in some cases are now finding out that there's additional surcharges, costs associated with that's being accumulated on there. And then you also have congestion in the ports. Your container may be offloaded not in the correct port initially, and it has to go through several handling. So for example, if you're not coming through the Mediterranean and your box was going to be offloaded in Malta, it may now have to be offloaded in Algeciras. And that may be an additional handling that you did not envision.
And how does this filter down, or do you expect this to filter down to the consumer? I mean, do we expect sort of inflationary pressures from all of this?
I do. I think it's not going to be as grand as what you saw coming out of the supply chain with the huge inflationary bubble that kind of popped at the end of that. But what you are going to see is an elevated freight cost. I mean, we're seeing that now. It's about 4 times as much to ship cargo from Asia to the Mediterranean, for example, than it was prior. Now we're seeing it stabilize. It's going to stabilize down, but we're also right in the process right now of working long-term rates between Asia and America. Those go into effect on May 1st. So we may see that increase of the long-term rates going in. And a lot of shippers use spot rates because they don't have a really consistent shipping schedule and they have to jump on the market where they can. And so what you'll see is some inflationary costs. You'll see some delays of goods that need to be there, summer clothing, things that should have been shipped early that didn't quite make it, summer furniture, a lot of seasonal things. But you're going to eventually see happen is it will stabilize out. There'll be extra ships on those routes. You'll see it standardized. But then the flip side of this is the Houthis stop shooting tomorrow. Well, it's going to take 2 to 3 months to reset the system back, and you'll have displacement on that side. So this is why Vincent Clerc at Maersk came out and said this is a months long, if not a years long event that we're seeing taking place. It doesn't have the impact that supply chain had back in 2020 and 2021, but it does have an impact that everybody needs to be aware of.
Do you see anything happening with the Strait of Hormuz by chance? I mean, is that the next area we should be keeping an eye on?
Well, the Iranians and the Houthi are giving everyone a lesson in how to impact global shipping. The Iranians have been doing this for a long time. We have seen instances of this. In many ways, what the Houthi are doing down in the Bab el-Mandeb, they took their lessons from the Iranians, and we know for a fact that the U.S. military has clearly identified that the Iranians are providing intelligence and data and equipment to the Houthi. So there is always that possibility of another choke point coming up here with issues. Obviously, the Straits of Hormuz is a worst case scenario because there's no detour around it. It's a one-way area. We saw the same thing happen in the Black Sea with the Russians and the Ukrainians. There's really not an alternative if you have to get oil and petroleum out of the Persian Gulf. You can't pipeline that amount across. There's not enough capacity there to do it. And so the Iranians have that capability. And, again, there are other key areas, South China Sea, the Straits of Malacca with China. We see that happening. Straits of Gibraltar, there was a talk about maybe issues with the Straits of Gibraltar. So there's always these issues. We see it up in the Baltic right now with the Russians and what's going on. So, maritime choke points have been this way historically for centuries for a very good reason, because they can impact the global trade.
So what if you were to surmise, where would you be looking at next, as far as where a possible problem could occur?
Well, I think one of the key things is it's hard to predict, obviously. Obviously, if we could predict this, it'd be great. I think one of the things that if I'm shipping cargo, I'm doing is looking at building a network and a system that has redundancy, that I can on the move switch if I need to. One of the things that a lot of shippers were able to do very quickly is when they realized that issues were coming up in the Red Sea is maybe move some cargo, go into LA and Long Beach, revise that route back up. So you really need to be nimble. You need to be watching this. And again, it's sometimes it's hard to know what the next issue is going to be. But one of the things is shipping is like pouring water on a sidewalk. It's going to find the cracks. It'll get through somehow. And so if you give it time, it's going to find a route to do it. The question is, what's that cost going to be and how long is it going to take? We worry all the time about what the next issue is going to be for obvious reasons, because it has the potential to shut down nearly all the global trade in some cases. But right now, what we're seeing is this diversion, and we're seeing it take place. The problem is going to be is if you keep adding on to this, we've got Panama Canal, we've got the Red Sea, we've got the Black Sea. If you start adding another one onto it, it creates a further strain on the system. And the way global shipping is really designed is it's not designed to flux more than a few percentage points in terms of capacity. And that's what we saw literally break the system almost in 2021, 2022.
I mean, in light of what we've seen now, because there's a lot of discussions going on about the future of the conflict between the US and China and what it means for Taiwan and whether or not the Chinese will invade Taiwan. But now, as we've seen that blockading a choke point in maritime trade is quote unquote not that difficult. So the Chinese probably don't have to invade if they should decide to do so. Taiwan, it's probably enough for them to issue a naval blockade, and it strikes me as that might be easier for them than is anticipated. Or is that, do you think, too far of a pessimistic judgment?
No, back in pre-World War II, you had national fleets. You had registries that were basically corresponding to the world's nations. You don't have that today. You've got the Marshall Islands, Liberia, you've got, Panama. But more importantly, you have these big, huge international, multinational corporations, and they're going to look at what is in their best interest for both their stockholders, their owners. They're always going to look at where they're risk adverse. And no one's going to take a chance to run a blockade or run through a area that the Chinese are contending. They will divert around. They will save their vessels. They'll save their cargo and go find another route around. And so, yeah, I think if the U.S. Navy or the U.S. military is looking at a potential China-Taiwan, that needs to be something to be aware of. Remember, don't forget, we saw the Houthi turn around U.S. flag vessels. It wasn't just Panamanian and Liberian ships. They actually turned around U.S. flag vessels, where, Maersk Lines, which operates as a subsidiary, which is under a Department of Defense contract, turns ships around. That's something you haven't really quite seen before. And so if you are the Chinese, who have much better weapons and much better capacity and capability, ocean carriers are going to be leery of that. Let's remember, when Russia invaded Ukraine, it was the big ocean carriers. It was Maersk, it was MSC, it was Hapag, it was ONE, who sat there and said, we're not going to trade with Russia anymore. And they pulled back out. And if you're going to make a decision between Taiwan and China, well, everybody's going to choose China. China ships a third of the world's containers around the world. 35 million out of 100 million containers are in and around China, on a year. Taiwan is going to lose out on that, even though Taiwan has some key commodities, high-tech, high-end microchips. In terms of just finance and the world economy, China is the winner in that scenario.
And if we were talking about, I want to kind of talk about the U.S. military at this point, or the Navy at this point, and kind of what are some of the problems that they're having with the Houthis, and are we a bit stretched right now, as far as, how many ships we have across the world right now?
So, I mean, if you look at this event in terms of history, which a historian I love to do all the time, is, go back to the piracy issue of the early 2000s. Piracy of the early 2000s wasn't defeated by navies. So the U.S. Navy did not do that. It wasn't the allied navies that did it. It was a combination. It was a use of military application of force to make it more difficult for the pirates to operate. But it was actually resolving the issue ashore in Somalia that did that. And if you look historically, that's what's happened. It's very hard to force a decision just by military might. You have to combine it with political elements. And the problem right now is the Houthi are really an oddball, because they're not a nation state. They're one faction in a three-way civil war in Yemen. So you have to apply force behind that. The question is, how do you apply political, economic force behind it? In truth, you have to apply it against Iran. Well, the U.S. can't do that. They don't even officially talk to Iran. This is one of the reasons that you saw the British Prime Minister come out a few weeks ago and say, maybe we need to do some conversations. Maybe we need to open a dialogue. Maybe we need to talk. Ironically, the one country that may be the tool here is China, who's been able to sail vessels through the Red Sea, not by use of military force, but by simply identifying their ships as Chinese, and sail through by either saying they have a Chinese crew on board, they have a Chinese flag, or they're not dealing with China. Costco pulled out of Israel entirely. And so maybe you can apply some force that way, because what we're seeing is the application of what is sometimes called maritime statecraft. It's not just the use of missiles and bombs, but you have to apply political and economic use to this too. And the problem is we're not doing that right now. And instead, we're hoping to get a resolution by military force only, which in historical ways, the only way to achieve that is by utterly destroying an enemy, which I don't think we're prepared to do in Yemen.
That makes sense. Does it look, we started, this operation that kind of fell apart with our allies. So does this make the U.S. look weak? I know that the EU has started a coalition on the sea this week. I believe they're starting. But how does this look to foreign nations?
It raises the question. I mean, because what you saw was a very slow response. I mean, we're on 3 months since the Houthis seized the Galaxy Leader, that car carrier, with that very dramatic landing on board the ship by helicopter. That was in mid-November. I mean, we're in mid-February right now, and we really didn't see the beginning of military protection and escorts till the middle of December. So this has been going on now for about 2 months. And again, the U.S. really lacked bringing suitable allies into this. It became very much a one-sided U.S. Navy with the British on alongside of us, but not a lot of other navies participating. And the issue then becomes is other navies are kind of playing this on their own. The Indian Navy, for example, India is a very interesting player in all of this. The diversion around the Red Sea impacts India greatly. If you're going to trade from India to Europe, you want to go through the Red Sea. It's the quickest route. It's right there. Now you're going 3 to 4 times a further distance for India, and India is in the process of really building relations. It's also refining a lot of Russian oil and shipping it back as diesel, and this is impacting them. A lot of crews are Indians, and what we're seeing is the Indian Navy playing a role here that is really disproportionate to their involvement. It's much bigger. They went full force into the area. And the question is, it doesn't really seem to be a unified front against the Houthi. It seems to be each nation doing their own little thing, which creates a problem. You really need to put this under one banner, but the U.S. is running an operation, the EU is running an operation, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Indians, the Chinese, everybody's running their own operation. And that creates really a big problem. Meanwhile, at the same time, Iran is providing a lot of assistance to the Houthi in these attacks. And what we just saw over the past few days is a ramp up in attacks against vessels and across they literally attacked a vessel bringing food into Yemen. So the Houthi, they don't have intelligence, but they're willing to attack any ship at all just to make their point.
And can you kind of go over, since it's fresh and it's happening, kind of the all the events that happened this weekend? Because we'll have this out, as soon as possible. And I think it'd be beneficial because it, was seemed like such a massive onslaught over the weekend.
So the U.S. early in February, just a week or two ago, conducted a cyber attack against an Iranian vessel that was basically providing intelligence. This vessel had been steaming off the coast of Yemen, and it was suspected of providing a lot of intelligence. And so they did a cyber attack on it, basically took it down its network. And the ship's been sitting in Djibouti now for 2 weeks. And what you saw was a kind of ramp down of attacks. There wasn't that many of attacks. Matter of fact, it almost went a week without any attacks. This follows on the heels of several strikes launched by the United States and the British against shore targets. Then all of a sudden, we just saw an unleashing of attacks. And what's kind of clear here is that the Houthi did not have good intelligence on the ships they were attacking, probably because the Iranian vessel was missing to provide a lot of that input. So they're using basically off-the-shelf, open-source intelligence, AIS tracking satellite information they're downloading, and just began a series of attacks on a variety of vessels. So one of the vessels they hit was a fertilizer carrier that was coming from Asia heading up into the Black Sea. And obviously with a load of fertilizer, it's explosive. The crew decided to abandon ship. We saw this grain carrier get hit. The ship was destined for Aden in southern Yemen. It got hit. What we're seeing right now is about the amount of traffic coming through the through the Red Sea right now is down about 50%, but in terms of tonnage, it's down about 60%. And the ships that are coming through right now are those that are on the lower tier of economics in terms of value, bulk carriers, crude oil carriers. And what we're seeing right now is the Houthi are attacking whatever vessel they can basically see and target. So they're hitting these vessels. And this may cause further dislocation of trade. If you're hitting bulk carriers, if you're hitting crude oil carriers, then they may start diverting around also. And this is having a massive impact in the region. We're not seeing food aid getting into Sudan. We're seeing the Saudis suffering because there's no ships hitting their western terminals. The Egyptians are losing massive amounts of money in terms of Suez Canal tolls. They usually make about $10 billion a year in Suez Canal tolls. It's estimated if this continues, they'll only make $4 billion a year. So this is having a huge economic dislocation in the region. And so the Houthi do not seem deterred at all. I mean, they are just launching attacks. There's more interdiction operations trying to stop the flow of weapons to the Houthi. We just saw a U.S. Coast Guard cutter up in the Persian Gulf stop a vessel that had equipment for these weapons. We're seeing the U.S. Navy board vessels out in this region. But again, it's very hard to stop the flow of weapons to the Houthi because they ship them in basically commercial craft, and there's thousands of them in this region.
Ralph?
I mean, is it on the long run? Is it a smart play by Iran? I mean, they run the risk to alienate also, let's say, countries that are more positively inclined towards them. I mean, on the long run, neither the Chinese, as you mentioned very insightfully, the Indians, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, but I mean, none of these countries have really an interest in seeing the trade flows interrupted for too long. I mean, particularly Saudi Arabia and Iran, there seemed to be some kind of rapprochement taking place over the last couple of months. Do you think it's possible that while Iran is a main supplier to the Houthis, that maybe their control is not as complete as one might think? So they are not just a proxy, but they're a proxy on occasion, but also follow their own agenda.
Well, I think you got to go back to the root cause of all this, which is Israel in Gaza right now. And that's been the issue. And, you know, many countries are opposing the Israeli response to the Hamas attack against Israel and the level and scope of Israel's response, which for many they view as disproportionate in terms of the amount of damage being inflicted on Gaza and the human toll that's being inflicted. And this is where Iran is supporting the Houthi on this. This is why you're seeing, for example, a rebirth of Somali piracy to a way, is the Somali piracy we've seen with actually the capture of a ship and holding it to Rouen, a Bulgarian-owned Maltese-flagged bulker. It's not following the model of past Somali piracy where you seize a ship, hold it hostage, and then a bag of money lands from the sky and you let it go. There's been no ransom for this vessel. So this is much different. And this is creating that polarization in this region because Israel and Gaza is the root of this. And Hamas, the Houthi came out in full force supporting Gaza. The Iranians have done the same thing. It's one of the reasons why the Egyptians can't really do anything in this scenario, because if they come out against the Houthi, then it looks like they're against Gaza, which is on their border. And all Hamas has to do is turn their rocket launchers 180 and hit the Suez Canal. So it creates this undercut, or the underlying issue here is that. And that's why Iran is giving such wholehearted support, I believe, to the Houthi. You're right. I mean, we saw this kind of settlement coming in place between Iran and Saudi Arabia, brokered by China, which seemed to be a pretty interesting development. But now it's been put aside. I wouldn't say it's completely dismantled, because you really haven't heard Saudi Arabia say too much either. I think they're trying to be very low key in what they're trying to do to support one side or the other.
I mean, I think that certainly sounds right. But let's assume the conflict in Gaza will find an end one way or another, right? Whether it's going to be the next couple of months or whether it's going to be next year. But of course, the memory will remain, right? The memory that this crucial artery of global trade can be fairly easily blocked. So don't you think that behind closed doors, kind of already steps are considered, that once, as you just described it, once the root cause is resolved, and even if trade flows are free again, that steps will be put in place that could have a very quick reaction if the Houthis should try to attempt this again?
I think the Iranians would want to restore order to an element. What they want is to be able to trade openly. That's what they want. They want the sanctions lifted off from the United States. And that's the leverage they have right now. And I think they're going to push that leverage quite a bit. They saw what happened with Venezuela's sanctions being released for the United States because of the need of oil. They may try to do that with it. The problem you're going to have, Bud, is the Houthi is once you let slip the dogs of war and you unleash the Houthi, you may not be able to get them back on the leash a little bit and control that. because now they're becoming the recognized government of Yemen in some ways, almost a de facto government, something they've been trying to do, even though they're largely a terrorist organization. And so the question is, will they do it? Now, Iran always has that formula of intelligence and weapon supplies. If they cut the Houthi off from that, then that should kind of mitigate it. But let's not forget the Houthi were attacking ships long before this. It was just very infrequent that we saw it happening. But again, once you let slip the dogs of war, it's very hard to fix this and get it back on. And that's going to be the problem, is restoring order. And again, making a situation whereby commercial shippers will be willing to risk their ships through this region.
And you saw this because you mentioned this particularly when you talk about getting them back on a leash. If you look at the history of the civil war in Yemen, pretty much everybody was allied with everyone at some point. So it seems that the durability of alliances there is rather short-lived. So it's not unlikely that at some point, if the Houthis should potentially find another benefactor instead of Iran, that they would switch allegiances on their own, or that potentially they could be, quote unquote, bought out by another player.
No, and again, the Houthi are demonstrating how a small group can grab global attention in a way. Again, in the past, it had to be a huge element, a massive attack of some kind. But here, again, they haven't killed anybody. They haven't, as far as we know, even wounded anybody yet. Yet, they're the centerpiece, and they're impacting global trade. And you got to sit there and go, the Israelis are killing people. All we're doing is making it more expensive for you to buy something from China. And so that argument will get support for the Houthi from other areas too. And that's the danger, again, is you may motivate other groups to sit there and say, I have the formula for how I can impact the globe. And that's by attacking trade, whether it's shipping, whether it's truck, whether it's air. I keep going back to a scenario where if this was happening to air travel and air transportation, the world would be up in arms about this. But again, shipping kind of takes place behind the scenes. We don't quite see it. And so therefore, we don't notice it too much. I keep talking to people in the United States. I haven't seen the impact of that yet. It's like, well, it takes time to work its way through the system to really impact you.
And what did we just have? And I just have to ask, because I find it really incredible that the Houthis just shot down a Reaper, a $32 million Reaper drone. So what kind of repercussions does this have, either militarily or, outwardly to other nations?
Well, I mean, this becomes the issue of drone warfare. Does drones represent a nation? Is this an attack on a nation? We've seen this happen. The Iranians have shot down our drones. We've shot down their drones. We're seeing, kind of drone warfare in full force on the Black Sea right now between Ukraine and Russia. In many ways, does this become a proxy war where you can, shoot down your robot, they shoot down our robot, and it's not considered an act? If it's one thing, if it's an American parachuting down in an aircraft, it's another thing if it's a Reaper. And so, this can create a larger escalation. The danger is an escalation, is that you see this escalation begin. The U.S. has committed a huge amount of force. We have a nuclear aircraft carrier. We have destroyers. We have a large footprint right now in the Red Sea. My concern that I have is that the U.S. attention to the area will wane. It will shift. You can't maintain this presence indefinitely. We can, but we won't because of political will. And so we're going to try to hand this off to the Europeans, but a lot of navies are not as capable as the U.S. Navy to defeat this type of weaponry. And so therefore, does that raise the threat of the area even more and create more of a dislocation in global trade? I mean, you can make the argument right now, there's no American ships going through the area right now. What America is trading with is going around Africa. And therefore, why is the U.S. Navy protecting ships that are largely carrying Russian, Chinese, and potentially Iranian goods in an area where the U.S. isn't trading anymore? And then again, they're going to have that argument. I don't 100% agree with that, but that argument's going to be had in the United States. Why are we spending this amount of money? They just talked about the fact that we shot maybe about 100 Standard missiles. Those are $4 million missiles a piece. Why are we spending that amount of money to defend trade that's not largely our trade? And so the Houthi may actually achieve. Do they run the U.S. Navy off? That's the narrative they would say if the U.S. Navy pulls out. So again, it creates a whole new set of scenarios for ocean trade. We've taken for granted for decades that shipping and goods can move freely on the oceans unimpeded. Now what we're seeing is that may no longer be the case.
So where does this is there any sort of resolution to this problem right now, or is this just kind of a lingering issue, so to speak? I mean, I don't, how does this get rectified if at all?
Yeah, I mean, again, the way you rectify this is, number one, peace in the Middle East, which I don't think is coming anytime soon, because that's a really tough prospect. What you're seeing in Israel and in Gaza right now, you just saw the U.S. president get rebuffed by Benjamin Netanyahu about this deal. Second is to leverage Iran, which is, again, very extremely tough when you don't have relations with that country. I think there needs to be it, but I think even third, if you get a unified UN sanctioned military operation in the area, that's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to provide that shield to ensure that shipping can operate in this area, because again, all it takes is the Houthi to get one hit and they're successful. And what we've seen too this past week is introduction of some new technologies, underwater drones, basically torpedoes, being used on surface craft, let alone the biggest threat of all, which is mines. If they start dumping mines into the water, that will potentially shut down everything. So it's hard to see what the resolution is, because what we're hearing right now from the United States and most of the countries is we're going to apply military force, but military force by itself, without the threat or the backing of a landing in the area to neutralize it, is not going to do it. And I'm not advocating that at all. I think a ground war would be a horrific idea to get involved in the civil war in Yemen. But the only way to do this is undercut the Houthi, is to cut the legs out from the Houthi. And the only people that can do that is the Iranians, potentially the Chinese, and providing equipment and supplies. It's very difficult to do. You have to make this work on a multinational level. We can't do it just unilaterally.
That makes sense. But if we cave to the Iranians, does that send a bad message, so to speak? You know what I'm saying? I mean, we just released $6 billion to them, and this is kind of our payback.
And it is, and it is a danger. It's the danger that you're acquiescing, that you're appeasing, that you're negotiating. But, if you look at the history of this, the way you resolve issues on the sea is on land. It's very hard to control the sea. That's one of the things we're finding out. Mahan know this back in the 1800s, and we're learning this today. You can control a little portion of the ocean, maybe for a little bit, but it's hard to control the whole thing. And without a huge commitment, I mean, you can commit forces, you can put aircraft carriers and destroyers and cruisers and all this military hardware in it, and you can make it, and you can convoy vessels through. But what's your duration of doing that? How much is that going to cost? What does that do to global shipping? And especially when what the commercial carriers are saying is, we're just going to go around Africa. We'll just go that way. It's open. It's available. We'll go that way. We'll charge you a little bit more, and we can continue on. Now, if something else happens that makes that route a problem, then you start seeing the issues. It's one of the reasons we've seen over the years, China, for example, has been very good about establishing alternative routes and about their whole Belt and Road Initiative, and ensuring that they're not hamstrung by one route. If you shut one door, they have two other doors they can go to. May not be ideal, may be expensive, but we can use those. And we see China doing that right now. We see that using the rail system across Eurasia. We see them using trucking across Eurasia. You've got the Russians screaming, hey, I got a whole northern route you can go. I can take you through the Arctic if you want. It's shorter, it's quicker, it's faster. You just got to pay me some money to use my icebreakers, and I'll get you through. So there's going to be a lot of people advocating for these alternatives.
From a purely hypothetical viewpoint, I mean, I know this would probably be politically impossible at the moment, but I assume in order to restrict shipping in these areas, you need to operate from the coastlines, right? You need to be very close to the water. Would it hypothetically be possible not to get directly involved in the civil war and the conflict, but just to say, I don't know, create a kind of demilitarized zone between the coast and, let's say, 20 miles inside of the country? I mean, in a sense, the United States did that during the first Gulf War, right? you defeated Saddam, but you let him remain in power. So kind of you had a very clear set goal, drive the Iraqis out of Kuwait, but other than that, left the regime more or less untouched. Could you do something similar there as well? Did you say, okay, you take over control militarily over the coastal regions, but what's happening behind it is up to the Yemenis and their different factions?
Yeah, I mean, you had, Iraq is a great example of that because you had the UN resolutions that set up no-fly zones. It allowed you to execute attacks on perceived threats in the area. Something like that could be done. The problem you have in Yemen is that literally the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandab, is right off the coast of Yemen. It's a funnel. It just comes down, and what you get is about 100, 200-mile long shooting gallery right off the coast. So, when you launch a missile, it's got maybe 15 to 30-second flight time before it potentially hits a vessel. So there's not a lot of distance there involved. And then, of course, you're putting yourself on the ground. You would have to push the Houthi back out. And again, there was a lot of calls for this during the height of the Civil War. Why wasn't there action by the UN and other countries during this time when the Civil War was in full force? Now we're getting involved just because our goods are at risk. So there is that potential. There's that potential to do that. And I do think the U.S. kind of failed in some ways in getting a full UN backed resolution to execute this mission, but there was a lot of question about whether they would get it. Russia would probably have vetoed it, right? Just because Russia will not agree with anything because of Russia-Ukraine. China may have vetoed it. Who knows? So it's hard to get that general consensus. So instead, what we have is this kind of factionalized response with the US running an operation, with the EU running an operation, and with all these other groups running operations. And I think the danger actually is if the Houthis strike at a nation that has a large military capability, they may respond. If they sink a vessel with Indian crew members on board and Indians are killed, I'm not sure how India responds to that because India has a large capable military. If you strike a Chinese vessel, kill a large number of Chinese, the Chinese may respond to that. It's not exactly clear what would happen here. And then if that happens, what you start seeing is that factionalizing and the regionalization of shipping and warfare. We go back to the 1930s, basically, in terms of, making seas unavailable to people and really starting to create this idea that you need to be under a national registry because you need the protection of your Navy. Right now, all these commercial ships are basically just getting the benefit of navies without having to pay for them. The Panamanian, Liberian navies are not coming. They're counting on the US and the British Navy. But there's going to be a question that eventually gets raised because it's being raised in the US right now. How much should we support Israel? How much should we support Ukraine? How much should we support this operation in and around the Red Sea? And especially when the next one appears, which we don't know where it will be.
But isn't that the thing, right? I mean, this if we kind of, as you just did, if you don't look at this conflict in isolation, if we go back to when we talk about root causes, let's look a little bit at, let's say, the root causes, quote unquote, of American temporarily or momentarily decline. If you look back at the retreat from Afghanistan in 2021, at least sometimes it seems like things have been spiraling down from that moment on. That at the one point when you're no longer taken, whether it's justified or unjustified, you're no longer taken seriously as the world superpower, regardless of your potential capabilities. If everybody believes you're not willing to use them, then everybody, quote unquote, will start to behave however they please. So if now Russia, Ukraine is one thing, because Russia, for all its flaws, is still a fairly mighty state, particularly given the role it plays in global resource supplies. But the Houthis are not, even though they are backed by Iran. So if they can do whatever they please without being severely punished, now you say, right, then you have the pirates in Somalia. And how do we know that more and more groups kind of will spring up trying to tease the once unipolar power, because they're not really afraid of any kind of repercussions, especially as you just mentioned. They probably fear the Chinese and the Indians, but it seems they don't fear the US and the Europeans.
It's the irony of the history of this, Ralph, is that you created economic systems that were nationalistic. Go back to the ancient mercantilism of Spain and Portugal and controlling the world's oceans, and you protected your fleet. And then you got to a point post World War II where you created this great blue ocean common where you didn't need a registry. You can be any registry, it doesn't matter. I'll pick a country and I'll put my flag on it because I don't have to worry about piracy or attack by foreign nationals. Now, as you mentioned, the U.S. kind of in the past 20 years has witnessed a kind of stepping back whether purposeful or not, it is seen as leading a void. And if you look in and around this region, what we've seen is, the Houthi attacking ships back in 2015, 2016, 2017. They attacked a U.S. Navy destroyer, the Mason, in 2016, fired missiles at it. There was a response to that. But again, what we saw was attacks. And most importantly, Iran has launched a series of attacks. Starting back in 2017, we saw several in 2019 with lipid mine attacks, with drone attacks. And again, it raises the issue that shipping doesn't count. It's hands off. It's an open target. No one is defending it. And what we're seeing is that means that anybody can take shots at it because it is a legitimate open target. And now when the U.S. comes in and says, well, we're going to defend shipping, that's different than what it's done in the past. It hasn't done that. If you go back to the tanker war of the 1980s, when Iran and Iraq were throwing missiles at each other, no one was defending those tankers. I mean, there were 450 tankers that were hit in the 1980s. It was only when Kuwait reflagged their tankers to the U.S. registry that the U.S. intervened. When the Somali pirates were grabbing ships, the U.S. didn't intervene. The only time we intervened is when it was a U.S. flag vessel, Maersk, Alabama, and they took an American hostage. The only time we react is when Tom Hanks is captured. That's it. Every other time, it's hey, you get sailed into the Somali waters and you got to get relieved. Now it's different. Now all of a sudden the U.S. is, we're going to defend global shipping. Well, that may be a little bit too late to announce that, because the Houthi are out of the bag, the Iranians are loose, and who knows what else is out there. Because again, what the Houthi are probably sitting there going is, well, you got run out of Afghanistan, you got run out of Iraq, you're going to eventually wear out, and we can last longer than you. And the Somalis figured that out back in the 1990s with the situation in Somalia. And so that's the danger for global shipping, that this just becomes the focus of attacks for now on. They become basically punching bags, and ships and mariners are expendable. I hate to say it, but that's true.
But this reminds me, and I don't mean to be off topic, but this reminds me a little bit, as you just mentioned, a little bit of a rerun of the 1990s, when before 9/11 happened, right? Bin Laden said, well, the United States are weak. Right, you had the bombings in Nairobi and in Kenya and in Tanzania. You had the USS Cole, which incidentally I think was in Yemen. Right, yep. You had all these attacks, and there was no significant reaction. So the expectation was, we can run them out of Saudi Arabia, we can run them out of the Middle East, because I think that the direct quote is, the United States are a paper tiger. And it seems now that we are rerunning what we did in the 1990s, potentially with the same effect. Because don't you think that at some point, it's a little bit off shipping, but I'm just curious to hear your take on this, that at some point you're going to have groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS or so that say, you know what, if they can't protect shipping lines, they also cannot protect their homeland. And then you have something resembling 9/11, and everybody will be very surprised again.
Well, it's not just that they're a paper tiger, but they have less capabilities probably today than they did back with that old Cold War military that existed in the 1990s. You had a pretty robust Navy, pretty large military. I mean, you were coming off the Cold War. Now it's peace dividends. It's 20 years of warfare in Afghanistan and in the Middle East. The focus, again, the focus is China. We've had this Asia pivot, this Asia orientation. The U.S. is focusing on that. The Mideast came kind of a backwater. Even Europe became a backwater. Look, where the U.S. was. Where was the U.S. prior to Russia invading Ukraine in some ways? And again, it seems like, well, we can get what we want. And unfortunately, that involves global shipping, because if the U.S. is the large guarantor of ocean shipping, that the oceans are free and open for everybody, if the U.S. can't do that, then that becomes a big, substantial problem, because that means that any group can impact trade, and we have taken for granted. It's like riding up and down a highway, and I don't for a moment think that I'm going to be attacked, riding up and down a highway. It's like I may get stopped by the police for speeding and those aspects, but I'm not worried about being raided. I'm not worried about being attacked up and down. And when you create that doubt, then you've got to change your mode of operations. You have to start changing. I grew up in New York City as a kid, and you know, I walked to school blocks, and when someone got beat up or hurt on a block I went to, my mom's response is take the other block, you know, walk, take a street over and walk to school. It's like, it's New York, get used to it. You're going to have to learn, and that's what shipping is doing. It's kind of shifting that way. The problem is you can't do that everywhere. In the Straits of Hormuz, you can. In the Black Sea, you can't. And so this is the danger we start seeing. And what this does is, because we're such an interconnected society in terms of trade and commerce, all it takes is one little butterfly effect, and you see it resonate across the entire supply spectrum.
Do you think this leads to sort of more protectionist issues globally, even with shipping, say shorter shipping routes, closer supply chain partners, and things of that, like deglobalization, in other words?
Yeah, I mean, you're hearing that with, you know, onshoring and elements like that. So if, you know, if you look at the amount of trade we get from China, it's decreased. But if you look at the trade from Mexico, it's increased. But then if you look at the trade from China to Mexico, it's increased. So, you know, I'm not exactly sure that the onshoring works in some ways. I think the most important thing is to have a well-rounded economy, not to be overly dependent on any one place or one area for the bulk of your goods and commodities. It's good to be diverse. It's good to have multiple sources coming in, something China's tried to do with Belt and Road, something Europe found out about being really economically dependent on fuel and energy from Russia. It takes a moment to realize that that may be a problem. I think there needs to be a rethinking about how we ensure that ships move around the ocean. I think it's fine to have open registries. I think it's fine. We've benefited greatly from this. The fact that we have outsourced shipping and lowered the cost of global shipping has brought the world's overall economy up. There's no doubt about that. It has been a massive beneficiary for everyone. However, we've gotten away with that without having to pay for protection on the seas. And now all of a sudden that has changed. As a matter of fact, one of the things the US Navy is dealing with is an identity crisis. The US Navy had saw itself as battling the Soviet Union and then being this kind of agent for deploying military force ashore. It really hasn't dealt with protection of trade. And in many ways, the US Navy doesn't like this mission. It's like, we don't like this. This is not what we're used to. It's not what we trained for. Historically, it's what they were created for. But now they've got to find themselves back in this role. And it's grueling work. It's not sexy. It's not Top Gun in any way, but it's really important to ensure that the ocean commons is available to everyone. And again, I think it raises the level of other nations too with them. This is their responsibility, not just ours. And so the US should be raising it. I don't hear a lot of issues being raised to the Japanese, to the Koreans. Where's your naval forces? You're as dependent on this as everybody else. Singapore, Taiwan, China's got ships there. What are you doing to help support this situation? The EU is great, but it's a long time. We're 3 months in. We're just starting to see the EU kind of organize their response to this, although we've seen individual nations come in. So I do think we need to look at things a lot differently now than we did. And again, there's opportunity, and this is a great opportunity attack because people see attacking ships as little to no repercussions.
And I don't want to take too much more of your time. We're coming up on the hour. So give us some final thoughts, some parting thoughts that we could make use of.
Well, yeah, I think one of the things you have to do is take a look at where we were just prior to this happening. And what we were seeing was the global economic trade, ocean shipping was really in an interesting period of time. We'd coming out of supply chain. We were seeing the new introduction of new ships for containerization. You know, the big issue facing shipping right now has to do with decarbonization, is getting out of the old process of fueling our vessels with diesel fuel and emitting huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. The goal IMO, International Maritime Organization, has is to decarbonize by 2050. That's putting a lot of emphasis on the shipping companies to develop these new technologies. And one of the untold consequences of sailing around the Red Sea is we're doing a lot more pollution because we're sailing an extra 3,500 miles. We're sailing faster than we normally do. And that means when you arrive in Europe, for example, you're paying a huge carbon tax because that voyage you just took is 2 to 3 times longer than you expected it to be, and you've had to go faster. The new technologies are really expensive, yet we're putting that on shipping, which in turn puts it on the consumer. So what's the new technology? Is it going to be LNG? Is it going to be ammonia? Is it going to be hydrogen? Is it going to be dual fuels? Is it going to be battery? Who knows what it's going to be? And shipping is where we're getting those technologies from. And what's really interesting is at times in the past where we've had these dislocations, we come up with new technologies. You know, the creation of the supertanker was created because the Suez Canal closed for 8 years because of the 7 years, the 7-day war back in 6-day war back in 1968. So, you know, we created new shipping. Are we going to see new container ships come out, even bigger container ships come out? Because if you're not constrained by the Suez Canal now, well, I'm going to build a 500-meter long ship. And I'm going to get 30,000 boxes on a ship because that's even more efficient than putting 24,000 on it. You know, one of the things we see here is how does shipping look at situations and how do they approve them? Does the Arctic become a more viable route, that northern route? Ocean shipping companies have said, we don't want to use the Arctic route because of the pollution and the issues. But if there are enough supply chain crises being caused by choke points, Suez, Bab el-Mandeb, Straits of Hormuz, the South China Sea, then maybe the Arctic is a viable region that all of a sudden now we take this route and now all of a sudden, you know, 2 new superpowers are in play that control those Arctic routes, Russia and Canada, you know, and now they control those routes. We're always looking for what's the next thing that's happening. And right now it's on steroids. You're seeing right now ocean companies and shipping companies really developing new technologies, new ways of doing it. And at the same time, we got to be more efficient in how to move goods on land and ashore, that intermodal connection between road, rail, and air. We're seeing that develop even further. People want their goods. I keep telling people all the time, the minute you hit that Amazon button on your phone and you think that good's going to be there in a day, it's already been moving for 6 months. And you have no idea, but the algorithms have already predicted what you are going to order and when you're going to order it. And it's got it at a distribution center, you know, a day away from your home. That's what the way we move goods today. And when you have disruptions, whether it's Ever Given in the Suez, whether it's a global pandemic, or it's the Houthi in the Red Sea, shipping is going to adjust. We're going to figure out a way to do it. If the Panama Canal dries up tomorrow and all of a sudden you can't get any ships through, we'll come up with a solution. We'll go around South America. We'll go around the Cape of Good Hope. We'll go across the country by rail. You'll see something develop. There will always be the next development. And so that's one of the things I love about shipping. It's how I make a nerdy YouTube channel interesting.
Excellent, Sal Mercogliano. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. We're going to put all your information in the description with a link to your podcast and, of course, your social media. Follow Sal on Twitter. He posts excellent information. And be sure to watch his podcast, What's Going On with Shipping, on YouTube. And we will see you again, you guys. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on, Sal. Thank you so much.